Hey everyone, what's up and welcome back. I'm Sam and you're here at Tabletop Archives for another one of our DM Firesides, by which I actually mean an archive dive, for our continuing series on D&D 5th edition. Today we're going to be covering the magic system of 5e. Before we get started, just a friendly reminder to like, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to hit that notification bell to make sure you get updates every time we post new content. Normally I'd put my Firesides disclaimer here, but that doesn't really apply and change is scary, so I don't really know what to do, so let's just get started. Magic. I'm going to really quickly hit the fluff and then go ahead and get into the crunch that you need to know to begin slinging spells in the Forgotten Realms, or whatever campaign session you prefer. So, magic in D&D works on the premise that there is something called the weave that permeates all of existence. You can't see it and you can't directly interact with it, but you can do things to produce various effects through the weave, otherwise known as spells. These aforementioned things are the gestures, components, and incantations that make up the process known as spellcasting. You gain access to this power through various means, whether that is through dedicated study, or a gift of power from a divine entity, or by bartering for power borrowed from an eldritch being. This characterizes how your magic works. So from a fluff point of view, two characters might have the same spell, but a cleric and a wizard are casting that spell very differently, which doesn't have any mechanical effect on the game, but for character building and world building, it can be a useful point to make. That's my only little DM soapbox I'm going to get on now. We're going to go back to the archive. Crunch-wise, D&D uses something called a Vancian magic system, which I could define in detail, but I won't because I'm about to explain it over the next couple minutes. The important thing about a Vancian system is that spells are discrete blocks of specific effects that have specific requirements for execution. So spell X always results in effect Y, and outside of the DM fiat, there isn't really any wiggle room. So, for instance, Scorching Ray shoots flame lasers, highly destructive, battle-ready flame lasers. While you could use it to magically light a campfire, it would be spectacularly overkill, and just because you know Scorching Ray does not mean that you have any other inherent ability or knowledge of how to manipulate or create fire. It's a specific effect. It's modularized. The rules for what each spell does are contained in various books, primarily the Player's Handbook, Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, the Temple of Elemental Evil, and Xanathar's Guide to Everything. Spells have components, which can be either verbal, material, or somatic. Verbal means you actually have to say an incantation out loud to cast the spell. Material means that you have to have a specific item on hand, and literally you have to be able to brandish it, is I believe how it is worded in the Player's Handbook. And somatic means that you must make some sort of gesture to cast the spell. If they have a somatic and a material component, you can use the same hand to make the gesture with whatever the item is. If, in any case, a spell says you need one of these components and you can't produce it for any reason, say because you are gagged or because your hands are tied, you can't cast the spell. Also, other characters may be able to notice your spell casting depending on what the components are. So if you are deeply intoning a dead language or shaking a bag of cockatrice spleens at someone, that might be a little bit of a tip-off. As an aside, some classes do have features that let them ignore certain component requirements in certain conditions, and each spellcasting class has at least one option for something called a spellcasting focus, which is a small, moderately expensive item, think a magic wand or that magic crystal at the end of Gandalf's staff, that satisfies most material requirements so that you don't need to keep track of your bag full of random magic junk. Spells are organized into levels, which are 1 through 9, and a special class called cantrips. High-numbered levels are more powerful, with cantrips being the weakest. Cantrips are extremely basic spells that either have minor effects or basic damage-dealing functionality, but they can be cast an unlimited number of times per day, unlike spells with levels, which we'll talk about here in a second. All other spells, which is to say leveled spells, consume a resource called spell slots. which regenerate typically on a long rest, which is your end of the day, 8 hours of sleep, go to bed, wake up, rest, with a few exceptions. Each spell has an associated level, and you must expend a spell slot of that level or higher in order to cast it. Most, but not all, spells can be upcast, which means that if you do choose to use a higher level spell slot than the minimum, it has an increased effect in some way, which will be specified in its rules text. You can still cast a spell that doesn't have an upcasting bonus using a high level spell slot, it just doesn't do anything extra. So it's usually not worth doing unless you've totally run out of lower level spell slots. You get a fixed number of spell slots per day based on your class and level, and in general, higher levels mean that you will have more spell slots and access to higher level spells. Okay, that was quite a bit. To summarize before I get into the second half, casting a spell requires the expenditure of a spell slot of a level equal to or greater than that of the spell and the satisfaction of any component requirements. Cantrips don't require a spell slot but are otherwise mechanically identical. Okay, cool, you might say. I now know how to cast a spell. But, you then ask, what spells do I actually know how to cast? Well, that depends. There are two kinds of spellcasters in D&D, prepared and spontaneous. And before anyone gets upset, yes, I know those aren't official rules terms anymore. That went away with 3.5. However, the bones of it are still there in 5th, so I'm going to keep using it because it makes sense. Spontaneous casters get to add a specific number of spells known to their personal list from a master list for their class every time they level up. From that point, as long as they have an available spell slot of the appropriate level and any required components, they can cast any of their spells on their personal list at any time. Prepared casters have an additional step. Prepared casters declare at the end of a long rest which spells they have prepared for the following day, off of their class's master list. The number of spells that you prepare is based on your level and your spellcasting ability modifier, and once you have picked your list, you can cast any spell off of that smaller list, provided you have the slots and components, and you pick a new list whenever you take a long rest again. Spontaneous casters are sorcerers, warlocks, bards, paladins, eldritch knight fighters, and arcane trickster rogues. Prepared casters are clerics, druids, and wizards. There's a few points of weirdness in there, but I'll talk about that at the end of the video if we have time. Spells, like characters, have stats. In addition to components and levels that we've already discussed, spells have a range, which will either be self for a spell that targets you, touch for a spell that targets something you can lay hands on, and obligatory joke, yes, you are always considered to be touching yourself, so you can cast a touch spell on yourself without going like this, or a distance in feet that they can be used at remotely. Spells also have a casting time, which is typically either one action, one bonus action, or a time in minutes. Spells also have a duration, which is either instant for a spell that happens and then is over without any persistent effect, or is expressed in rounds, minutes, or hours, sometimes days, but not very frequently. A spell with a duration of permanent lasts until dispelled or some other condition is met as specified in that spell's rules text. Some spells also require something called concentration. You can only maintain one spell at a time that requires concentration, and if you take damage while concentrating on a spell, you must succeed on a Constitution saving throw or the spell immediately ends. The DC of the save is 10 or half the value of the damage you took, so Constitution is actually a fairly important stat for spellcasters. I mentioned something called a spellcasting ability score. In every class that has the spellcasting class feature, there is a block of text in the rules for that class of spellcasting that says your spellcasting ability score is whatever. It's typically going to be a mental stat. It's always going to be a mental stat. You don't cast spells with strength. Any spell that has an offensive nature to it or is otherwise used in an unwilling subject will have either a spell attack or a spell save. Spell attacks, whether melee or ranged, are always a d20 plus your proficiency bonus plus the ability modifier for your class's spellcasting ability score. Your spell save DC for all of your spells is equal to 8 plus your proficiency modifier plus your spellcasting ability score. Each spell's rules will specify what kind of save your target will have to make, and on the subject of spell attacks, these are still subject to the same rules that regular attacks are. So if you have to make a ranged spell attack while there is a hostile creature within 5 feet of you, you make it with disadvantage. Okay, so here are our exceptions. This is all the weird stuff that doesn't really fit anywhere else. So 1, If a spell has a material component that actually has a price listed in the spell's stat block, you cannot substitute it out using a spellcasting focus. You have to actually have that item on hand. Some spells will further specify that a valued material component is consumed when the spell is cast. You've got to shell out for that component every time you cast those spells. However, these are typically very powerful spells, generally your resurrection spells, and then very high level spells that have semi-permanent effects. Point 2. Wizards have an extra layer to their spells known. Rather than preparing spells directly off of their class's master list, they choose spells to copy into their personal spell book every time they level up. When they then prepare their spells, they prepare spells from their personal spell book rather than the master list. While this does sound like kind of a severe limitation on paper, Wizards have the largest spell master list of any class by a wide margin. They get the same number of baseline spells prepared as everyone else that prepares spells, and they can add extra spells in addition to the ones they get from leveling up by expending time and money to copy spells they find while traveling into their spell book. So theoretically, they can get the most spells available out of any class. And point 3, Warlocks are just unusual. I'm not going to go into all the weird ways that Warlocks are unusual, but for the purposes of this video, what you need to know is Warlocks have a severely limited number of spell slots, but their spell slots refresh on a short rest. And also, finally, with regard to cantrips, even if you are playing a prepared caster, your cantrips known are picked when you level up, and they are static just like a spontaneous caster's spells. Alright, once again, we're getting wrap-up time. Thank you all for joining me here today at the Tabletop Archives. Again, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and don't forget to hit that notification bell. It's been great having you here today. I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Sam out.